If someone were to ask you, have you ever made a bad decision on a call that you were sent on? You'd probably respond, which call you want to hear about? But if I asked you, have you ever made a bad decision on that call because somebody withheld information from you, whose faces would you see? Would it be the victim or the victim's family and friends? Could it be the homeowner or the business owner on the fire scene? Or possibly it could be one of the many witnesses you interviewed in the critical incident response that you had to respond to. Welcome, my name is Stan Walters, and I'm going to share with you in this session on fire service and law enforcement training, effective narrative-based field interview techniques, effective techniques for the field interviewer and first responder. I've spent nearly 40 years as an expert in the field of interview and interrogation. My work has included research at Johns Hopkins University, NYPD, State Department, Defense Department, working with Johns Hopkins and John Jay College in studying the science of interview and interrogation. My clients now include the military, law enforcement, fire service, military intelligence, government intelligence, in training their agents and officers the most effective tools for gleaning as much information as possible and necessary to make a field critical information recovery. How do I maximize the amount of details and information? In this next video, we're going to spend time looking at the narrative-based field interview and how we can maximize the amount of details we get from every call, whether it's a crime scene, whether it's a fire scene, whether it's a medical call, whether it's a critical incident response, when information is critical. And what can we do to maximize that information recovery from those interviews? You might be surprised to know that 50% of the interviews that fail, 50% of the interviews that fail of victims or witnesses are the direct result of the tactics and techniques used by the interviewer. Techniques that fail to data mine the information or contaminate the subject statement. We're going to look at the narrative-based technique and how you as the field interviewer and first responder recover 60% more information in each of those field interviews and make effective decisions in a timely manner on the scene. The information we're going to cover in our block in this video section, the source of it is over 60 years of research in the field of victim interviews, witness interviews, memory, statement recovery, and recall. And that research has been done not only in the law enforcement field, but in fire service field, in medical response, critical incident response. And so you find it applicable across multiple different disciplines. It's not limited to just one specific field. But what are we doing in this segment, because of our limited time, I'll be using maybe a select example from law enforcement, I might use one from fire service, I might use one from critical incident response or from medical emergency. But the tactics are based on human behavior themselves, which transcends or transfers across all those disciplines. How do we maximize that detailed information? And what does the science support is most effective in interviewing people in those different environments and different settings? There's been extensive research on the interviewers who have the most effective techniques, and specifically what works and doesn't work in the interview setting. One example of a piece of research is over 600 videotaped interrogations taken and videotaped from 3 different jurisdictions. The idea was to see which techniques were most effective in getting details from the people that are being interviewed. What were the tactics of those interviewers? The researchers looked at every method used, whether they were sitting close to the subject, whether they were touching the subject, did they use accusatory style? Did they use a narrative-based style? Was it personality specific? Were they minimizing? Were they maximizing? Were they using rationalization in the conversation? Were they using criteria-based content analysis? Were they using control questions? And they looked at all those methods that each of the interviewers were using. Then they looked back to determine which of those techniques had the most success. In each of those 600 interviews, which tactics was the interviewer using, which you got the greatest amount of detail. And it came down to basically 2 to 3 various tactics. Anytime these tactics were used, success rate was raised to over 80%. Now, it may not be a high number for you, but I kind of like to have an 80% chance when I walk in the interview room. So they found there was 2 basic forms or tactics used that created the most success in the interview room. First thing, the interview itself was narrative-based. That's going to be the focus, primary focus of our time together on this video, is looking at the formula and the success of the narrative-based interview and how to conduct this in the field interview, getting the greatest amount of detail. The second characteristic was that the interviewer adjusted to the subject's cognitive and emotional changes. In other words, instead of having a set formula or having a static menu like a Martha Stewart menu, the interviewer was aware enough to adjust to that victim or witness's emotional changes as they discussed the details of the event they witnessed, or what they have been victimized from, or as they're trying to assist in a medical emergency or a critical response. The interviewer understood and connected with that subject and understood what they were going through, and then modified their tactics, modified their approach based on the response of that subject. When they did this, as I mentioned, their success rate was nearly 80% in recovering information. So the time together, we're going to focus on these two areas. What essentially is the narrative-based interview, and how do I apply that in the field? Now, you've seen this happen many times on the job with maybe a new piece of equipment, or perhaps a new computer system or software. If a process or system or piece of equipment is too complex to use, if it's too burdensome, what will happen? Well, the people are going to start monkeying with it. They're going to start taking it apart. They're going to start reassembling it. Or as Tim the Tool Man Taylor used to say, they're going to try to tweak it. I think that's what happens in the majority of the interview processes that we learn. It's become so complex and so burdensome that we fail to follow along because it doesn't give results, and we start improvising. So what you find with the narrative technique, it is very intuitive. It's very conversational. It also allows the subject, the victim, the witness, the homeowner to feel at ease. At the same time, you're recovering more information than this person ever knew that they had. In some cases, you'll notice that you'll literally be teaching this person how to use their memories better. And you'll be able to data mine more detail from them. Since I've been teaching this, I've been teaching about 30 years full-time and using this process. There's been at least 4 different scientific studies testing the narrative-based technique. And they found that at minimum, a very minimum, that interviewers were capable of recovering 60% more information than the other methodology. Now, as a side benefit, if by chance you happen to move the interrogation side, and you've got somebody on the scene, you have the victim, maybe a witness who's deliberately trying to mislead you as the investigator, or mislead you as the first responder, this process has a bonus in that it increases our ability to spot deception by 68%. Now, what's fascinating about that 68%, on average, people only catch about 50% of the deception that occurs in front of them. They miss 50% of the lies that occur. Now, this has been tested several times looking at taking video, for example. Take a piece of video and they got somebody from civilian population, they got 25 people from law enforcement and fire service. Have them watch video. And said, okay, is this guy lying or not? Is he withholding information? They missed 50% of the time. It's tested with judges, it's tested with lawyers, it's tested with media, law enforcement, fire service, corrections people, school teachers, wives, kids. Nobody got 50% of the information, a better average than 50%, except one group, and that was inmates. Inmates can catch somebody withholding information 68% of the time, which proves the adage, it takes one to know one. This process, the narrative-based interview, will help me find those victims and witnesses who are, for whatever reason, withholding or giving me misleading information to cause me to make that bad decision we talked about. So it'll help me isolate those spots that, as the interviewer, you get that piece of detail, what do I need to follow up on? So this also creates a very efficient interview. It compresses the amount of time and energy we waste and higher return on details and information. So let's take a look at the process. And first of all, we're going to look at the difference between what is a narrative-based interview versus the traditional accusatory-based interview and why the two are in conflict with each other. Let's define what we mean by success is the end game of the interview. When I'm talking about an 80% successful interview, contains 3 factors. Number 1, have we gotten the maximum recovery information that's available from those victims or witnesses we're interviewing? Number 2, are my statements uncontaminated? Uncontaminated by the tactics of the interviewer. Clean, uncontaminated statement from that source. Number 3, does the interview gain the cooperation and compliance from those subjects or victims or witnesses that we're interviewing? That's how we measure the success of a field interview. Let's define when we talk about the 80% success rate that I'm describing. The narrative-based interview has the ability to retrieve information that you need to make on-scene decisions. Whether it's a critical incident response, whether it's a major fire, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's disaster management of the scene, how do I solicit and recover the details, information I need to make a decision about deployment of equipment, deployment of services, deployment of medical personnel, by my interviews of the victims on the scene, of the witnesses that are there, of homeowners, of business owners, that I can glean that detailed information they need to make an informed, accurate decision under pressure and in a critical incident response. One of the problems that happens in most of our interviewing tactics is we have an end in mind. And we tend to conduct, as a result of that, more of an accusatory or a very contaminating type of dialogue. For example, you didn't see him hit the car, did you? Now you could translate them to different settings, but already you see that it's feeding details, it's contaminating the subject statement. And that tends to be more accusatory style. Unfortunately, that's used roughly 66% of the time and has the highest probability of disrupting recall or disrupting or contaminating information. What's happening is that in that field interview, you're getting an echo effect. You're not really getting information from people, you're getting to validate what you think has happened. And so you're making a less informed, a decision in the critical response. A more narrative-based interview, one that solicits the help of that subject, whether it's the fire scene, whether it's the first responder to a major accident scene, etc. My goal is to try to get some cooperation, to maintain compliance with that person, because in the end I may need to go back to them again. I may need to have that witness cooperate for any type of statement or any follow-up or redeployment or to reassess cause, purpose, origins, responsibility, etc. Not even in the judicial setting. Now in a criminal interview, it's the same process. How do I not contaminate those victims and witnesses when they do make type of statements? Or for example, if it's an OSHA case where there's a safety issue involved, or it's an inspection of a facility, of a building, of a warehouse, and we're looking at safety issues and compliance. So narrative interview recovers greater information from those individuals at a tune of a minimum of 60+% more information. Now you make a more informed decision. Now you've got more details to make an accurate decision for the best use and deployment of your equipment, your manpower, your services, and efficient use of that personnel and staff without wasting about chasing incomplete responses. Sending people off on dead errands, it's wasting your manpower and time. But if it is a critical incident scene, such as the fire scene or I got a medical scene, now I've taken control of the interview, and we'll talk about at the end how to manage the interview. I need details critical when for example, let's say my victim can't talk, or is non-responsive. Now I've got to rely on family members. Now I've got to rely on spouses. I've got to rely on friends. Tell me what's going on, what was he doing? What was his activities? So now I can make a better medical decision in a hurry and get the best treatment that's most effective for that patient in that triage setting. We're going to break down and take a look at the narrative-based interview and how we use that to get an information-rich statement that's full of data. Now I can make a fully informed decision because I've got more details and my decision is more accurate, is more efficient in the end game. Let's look at this narrative interview and how easy it is to apply in the field setting. If it's too complex, your officers, investigators, and your responders won't use it. This is a very intuitive process, and the interesting part is it gains cooperation from your victims, witnesses, and sources, and you keep them compliant. Now you've got a good cooperative flow of information back and forth between the interviewer and your source. So let's talk about the narrative philosophy interview and the origins of it. 40 years worth of work and research. There's been a lot of videotaping of interviews. And in different fields, again, the law enforcement, fire service field, medical field, critical incident response. And they were looking at what interviewers were having the greatest success. And they found the interviewers that got the most information, the greatest detail that we talked about, that their interview philosophy fell into a very simple 4-part philosophy. And this is going to be the heart of our segment of video, that narrative-based interview. This is going to be most effective for the field interviewer. First portion the first element, there's a period of orientation. Let's briefly use an example of orientation. Sometimes you hear this being called developing rapport, which is just fine. But you're going to know there's on some scenes and some calls you're going to respond to that no matter who you're talking to and how hard you work, you ain't never going to have no rapport with them. You just open hostilities and the fight is on. But I still need to manage that. I can't give up, I can't get away because the details are still there. So we've got to find a way through that. So the orientation, let's say for just the first few minutes, let's use a court scene. Let's say everybody's seen that realistic crime show, Law and Order. And the guy gets on the witness stand, he takes the oath of office. You know, takes the oath, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and so forth. For the first few minutes, and maybe it's a judicial hearing. You've seen it in hearings for personnel, for example. We see this in refereed hearings for unemployment and so forth. So it's the same process. For the first few minutes, the prosecutor asks, or the attorney will ask, tell me about your background, tell me about your experience, and so forth. And so what we're doing, we're getting just a basic feel for that person. I'm getting a reading what type of emotional state they happen to be in, and we're going to talk about how to manage that emotional response. What's their cognitive state? I get a little idea of their intelligence, their speech style, and so forth. So the advantage here is I'm developing a connection or bond with that person I'm talking to. Depending on the situation. Now, for example, let's take the road officer, interdiction case, for example. That orientation process may only be 90 seconds. This could be, if it's a critical incident response, got a major disaster, this could be just as short as 15 to 20 seconds. It's literally, if you're going to converse with a person, you've got to pay attention to their mindset and emotional status. Because it's going to dictate how I talk to them and how I listen and filter their information. So you get a sense of their speech quality, you get a sense of their body language, a little bit sense of their communication skills and so forth, because that's going to be critical. This is where we're establishing what we call a constant or a baseline for that person. Then my next step is I'll allow them to narrate. This is the big change they found in this effective interviewing, was a narrative process. Let's go back again to the court case, civil case or criminal case. What would happen if the prosecutor said, is it true on June 6th you're at the corner of Walk and Don't Walk, you saw a 1969 Ford Econoline van driving eastbound in a westbound lane, its lights off, swerving violently, sideswiped several cars, crossed the median, jumped the curb, and crashed in the playground where the fish fry was for the St. Leo's Catholic Church, injuring a bunch of people. If he did that, what would you hear from the defense attorney in the courtroom? Objection, Your Honor. And the grounds would be what? Leading the witness. That's the contamination we want to avoid. That's not a narrative interview. And that's the difference between the accusatory and narrative style we're looking at. In the narrative, as I first arrive on the scene, I'll isolate my witnesses, my sources, and I use a very open-ended narrative type comment. Tell me what happened. Tell me what went on. And you let them, at this point, that individual, whatever role they're in, narrate the circumstances of event. Now, we're going to explode this narrative process here as we progress through the video. And I'll show you how to maximize the narrative and how to data mine that detail. Once they're past the narrative, and we are the facilitator here, we're not directing, we're not challenging. Even if you suspect they're withholding information, you let them go at this point, because it's the next step, the cross-examination portion, when you follow up and you ask them, go back and tell me about this part, I need to know. I'm confused about what you saw when you first arrived on the scene and you saw the smoke coming from the windows. Let's go back to that part. And this is where I now, from my narrative, I'm able to zero in what's missing and fine-tune that data that's been overlooked or withheld. And I'll give you some, again, effective tools to cross-examine that point without contaminating the subject. Remember, one of the success things was not to contaminate the subject and maintain cooperation and compliance. The final piece is the resolution portion. Is now correcting the mistakes, doing the the update. So I now have the clearest, most concise, detailed, accurate statement that I was looking for in the beginning, my 80% success rate. I've got the maximum information. Okay, I've got the details from the subject. I haven't contaminated an individual. That's the end game. In the field, you may progress through these 3 points several times before you get finished. As you clear each point, as you clear each, bury each missing detail, you'll go back and reset and re-narrate again. So don't feel uncomfortable that it has to be all or none shot at one time. And we'll talk about managing the interview toward the end of the tape, how to overcome that overloading the subject, because if you throw too much at them, you'll actually begin to contaminate and you destroy the narrative process. So this is our structure, our formula. Orientation, establish a baseline, creating that rapport, the dialogue with the subject, facilitating them and letting them narrate, whether they're the victim, the witness, the business owner, whether it's the crowd around, whether it might even be interviewing local officials about the resources and materials that they have available at the disposal, how quickly you can reach out and call on those resources to bring in. Do they really have the resources to meet the needs to combat the situation? So it's still even narrating as a supervisor or narrating as a scene commander. Then following up on the unclear or the inconsistent or incorrect details that we've identified during the narration, and then the final clearing up. Here is the most clearest, concise details information they want. So we'll work through each of these points, how to maximize that on scene as that first responder. Now, the amount of time that a narrative interview might take, that formula we looked at, this can be of any length. In a critical situation, you may have a limited time of only 5 minutes for the dialogue. If it's a longer period of time, you have more availability, you can go up to 30 minutes to an hour to 2 hours to 3 hours, depending on the nature of the interview. So it's not restricted as to how long has to be spent. There doesn't have to be a minimum amount of time, doesn't have a maximum amount of time. In the end, your objective is how much information can you get. Every year I work at a conference in Las Vegas. Now, I'm not a big gambler. I can lose at a dollar change machine. Okay, I'm just not lucky. I'll play nickels because I can take $5 worth of nickels. How many of you will spend $20 at the movies, right, on popcorn and movies? I'll play the nickel machine. My whole objective is how long can I make $10 worth of nickels last? Or how many plays can I get? I know I'm going to lose my $10. I know that. But I'm happy. I was in Vegas recently and I spent $10 and I think I spent like 2.5 hours playing nickels. Think of this just the same way. How much can you get from your investment? If you only have 5 minutes to invest in the interview, see how much information you can get from that high intensity situation, how much information you get out of 5 minutes. If you've got the time and the resources and you can spend an hour to 2 hours with it, then you've done the same thing. But the end game is the amount of data. Time is based on what your limitations are. And it'll stand and adjust elastic based on that. So my objective with that in mind, okay, kind of a time neutral setting, if I'm interviewing victims, interviewing a witness, or sources. How do I have gotten my best value for my investment nickels? Okay, first of all, have I maximized or can I maximize the amount of information? That's the goal. Maximize as much details as I can with limitations. And the information, the goal is details, and what's that other word? Oh yeah, more details. Every decision maker never feels like they've had all the details they wanted. They never feel like they've gotten every single thing they need to make the best informed decision. This narrative process gives you that data to make that fully informed decision. Critical response, emergency response, field interview, interdiction interview, as the case may be, interviewing the victims, or you got multiple. And let's say that you have a large number of people to go to very quickly. You can narrow the parameters of your interview And you can hit 15, 20, 30 people in a limited period of time just by focusing on one piece. Another objective in interviewing the victim, witness, or source, depending on the scene, and we'll look at other objectives here in a moment. I need to get or to sustain compliance. My goal is I want them on my side, and at worst, at least neutral. I don't want them working at cross purposes to me. An accusatory interview creates a hostile victim, witness, or source. Narrative interview establishes and strengthens, so what it does, it solidifies, if I can spell solidify correctly, solidifies compliance and commitment from that individual to continue working and talking with you. And so now that I've got a better chance of getting accurate information, and they're committed to being on my side as opposed to working against me. And that narrative interview, my objective, is the reduction of contamination on the part of the interviewer. So again, there's not a set clock timing. Working with an agency, and a supervisor said that all interviews should never take more than 20 minutes. Anything longer than that, you're wasting time, quit. What a horrific philosophy. The interview takes what it needs to take. When you've met these objectives of maximizing information, whether it's 20 minutes or if it's 2.5 hours, then you've done the job. That's the game. You've got the maximum amount of details to make that fully informed decision about placement of personnel and equipment, or to follow up on the incident, follow up on the accident scene, follow up on the industrial accident, the spill, or if you're doing environmental work, an environmental spill, what's the routine of the in the containment field, how well it was built, okay? Keeping the compliance of that person so that they are a source with you, because I may need some time to go back with them. And a point we should think about, never assume you'll get to talk to the subject a second time. Never make the assumption that, well, I'll get what I want now, I'll go back later. Because if we do, what happens? That dude Murphy shows up. And in between time, somebody else will contaminate that statement. Somebody else will talk him into not cooperating with you. He'll clam up on you. It will take off. He'll lawyer up, or he'll kill himself in the worst case scenario. The first one needs to be your best one, and assume it may be your only one. So whatever commitment you need to do to obtain these objectives, that's what you're in the game for. Maximize the return that you get for your investment with the time with the subject. Let's talk about the objective now, interviewing suspects or uncooperative subjects. The outcome of an interview is based on the mindset and the philosophy, interview philosophy of the interviewer themselves. One of the biggest problems that happens in any interview, whether it's a victim, whether it's a witness, whether it's an informant, whether it's an applicant, is the preconceptions by the interviewer. I wrote an article recently about the biggest problem interviewers have is a phenomenon called preconception assassin. If you have your mind made up at the end what it's going to be, it doesn't matter what the data tells you. If you have in your mind that that my interview's sole purpose is to prove that I'm right, then you're not listening. And the most important skill of the interviewer is the listening process. So coming in with an assumption, and it's hard for human beings to be totally objective in the first place, we know that. But if you come in with the mindset, this person is going to tell me what happened, or they are going to tell me that the fire or the spill or the incident occurred this way, it doesn't matter what the subject says, we aren't hearing it. So we've got to be intellectually honest enough to accept the information that the subject gives, whether it matches what we believe versus what the evidence in the scene and the incident tells us. And that it specifically applies with subjects and uncooperative subjects. We tend to be more in a preconceptive state interviewing subjects and uncooperative subjects than anything else. So to fit that, the first thing, our objective is not a confession. Sorry to break your heart. That's not my goal in interviewing a subject. My subject is how much information. Will you agree with me? I can get a confession and I can still lose the case. You'd be interested to know that of all the cases overturned by the Innocence Project group and the cases overturned on wrongful conviction, where they used, for example, DNA, 25% of those convictions initially started because of a false confession. 1 out of 4. That's because those interviewers had a preconception. They were biased before they did the interview. If the subject gives me an alibi statement, and I'll take that, I'll take an alibi statement all day long. And what I'll do is I'll lock that down so tight. And if the subject, you plan to commit to it, all I got to do is go back and prove what as an investigator. If I'm objective enough, I'll go back and prove that's a lie. So I've totally destroyed my subject's alibi. So I can, if the subject is not going to be cooperative and truthful, I'll get as in-depth and as detailed as an alibi statement as I possibly can, then go back and show where they have misled me. So what that does, it helps me isolate the deception. In other words, it's essentially it's lead development. Just so happens I'm working on a case right now involving a fraud with some businesses. And it's very interesting what the guy that's a subject fraud investigation is doing is trying to mislead or use influence and to intimidate that he's got these sources. Well, the more that he shoots his mouth off and talks about how he's going to sue everybody that's getting him for fraud, he's literally telling me where he's vulnerable. And the fact that he's floating money between 3 different corporations, that he has been mixing private and personal funds, that he has been filing fraudulent inspection documents. This happens to be, in some cases you've been working on, happens to be working on housing, buildings, and construction. And he's defrauding people by conducting construction and installations without the proper license. If you're doing inspections, if your job is in safety inspections, home inspections, fire inspections. This guy is fraudulently filling out the forms of compliance. And by his statements, he's literally told me where to go look to find where he's been violating procedure, violating code. And then the final element, again, is to reduce contamination. We looked earlier, we talked about the difference between a narrative and accusatory interview. An accusatory interview, if I'm not careful, I'll give away my ace cards. I'll give away the secrets that I know in my case, and now I've told my subject where he or she needs to create an alibi, where he or she needs to protect themselves. Because what happens, we develop kind of an echo chamber. And that's what happens again with a preconception on the part of the interviewer or the supervisor or the scene commander, making the statements fit their conclusions. It needs to be the reverse side around. So this reduces that ability to contaminate. So again, for our subjects and uncooperative subjects, my goal is not a confession. Remember, it's information. You said, I can get a conviction without a confession because I've got enough information based on the alibi statement, based on isolated deception, based on lead development, I can prove that this person was the actor or was negligent in the construction of the building, was negligent in the installation of the suppression system, fire system, there was negligent in the operation of the vehicle or their weapon, caused the death or whatever. Okay? And I can isolate the details. So confession is not the end game. If all he thinks we can get a confession, if I go out here and think I'm going to wander in the woods and I'm going to find Sasquatch, I'll find something that looks like Sasquatch. I'll take a picture and I convince you that Sasquatch is in that picture. It's not confession. Data mine as much information as possible. Maintain the compliance, isolate the leads, reduce the contamination. So let's look at the narrative portion and now the mechanisms of how to evaluate the statement and its value toward you in the final decision on maintaining the scene and working your case and deploying resources through a narrative-based process. And before we move forward, let me add one more thing here. We focus on the concept of confession. If that's not your end game, it doesn't have to be confession as in the criminal sense. It could be the homeowner, it could be the plant owner, it could be the plant operator. It's not necessarily I'm after confession, but that they are forthcoming, that they're acknowledging or they are truthful in their disclosure of information and details, that they're not withholding something from you, knowing that that piece of detail could change your decision. So it's the focus is not necessarily the confession, but the information, fully disclosed details. So I got a fully compliant, fully cooperative, detail-rich statement even if it's non-criminal case. Have I got the full disclosure from that person I'm talking to? Remember, your application of this process is not time specific. If you're the first responder, for example, in a robbery call or a shooting incident or a domestic violence call, and you've got mere 15 to 20 seconds, it would be a luxury to have someone tell you what the subject looked like, which direction he head, what vehicle is he driving, how far has he progressed, is he still unseen. That's the type of critical information we talk about that you can recover very, very quickly and keep the subject focused on that information, that details. Now, with that in mind, there will be times when you get to the scene, you're going to have subjects who are going to be excluded from normal types of behavior. So let's take a look at those folks that will give you very inconsistent reactions and whose statements are contaminated other than by the interviewer, but by medical conditions or by other limiting factors. And so you're going to get marginal results from them. Not something the interviewer has necessarily done wrong, but just by the nature of who you're dealing with. The process you're talking about is not going to work very efficiently on mentally disturbed subjects, or clinically known as the psychotic. They'll give you information that events that never happened. This is when you can get the calls, the nuisance calls, that somebody's coming to my house and they're poisoning my water, or they're spying on me. They're hiding in the attic. They put a bomb on my car. And so you've made this call, and you get there, and you've got an incident, and you realize this is not really an incident. It is part of the mental illness of that subject. And so now it's time to make a decision. Okay, now that we need to refer to mental services. Now we need to get EMTs or medical personnel on staff. We need to talk to family. I need to look in the house and see what medications are going on. And there's telltale signs that you're dealing with the psychotic individual. They'll describe people that don't exist, conversations never happened, and locations nobody's ever heard of before. This, by the way, is approximately 1% of the human population. But they make up 16% of our prison population. So this 1% group has a higher correlation within our corrections facility, justice facility. So you may also see their act, for example, let's say it's an arson, may not be in terms of most fires as being malicious or to cover a crime or for financial reasons. It's because their actions are driven by their mental illness and not some criminal intent as such. Another group that we have difficulty with is going to be the brain diseased or the brain damaged, if you will. This can be from multiple things. This can be from Alzheimer's. It can be from dementia. It can be from head trauma. It can be from excessive drug abuse. For example, if you get to a location and you've got to fire and uncover the fact that it's a meth lab operating in that place. And we already know the hazmat's got to come in. We know they've got a serious risk, explosion, fire, extensive property damage, and so forth. This guy may be the one that's operating because he's using his own product. And you'll see here that the difference between mentally disturbed and brain damage. Think of mentally disturbed as like there's a software problem with their brain. Okay, they keep getting the blue screen of death, right? Brain disease, there's a hardware problem. That there's some impairment physically with the brain. Again, it could be head trauma, it could be, again, dementia, arteriosclerosis, glue sniffing, paint sniffing, meth, long-term use of cocaine, crack, alcoholic DTs, and so forth. Telltale sign here, it's interesting, is they'll have a lot of problem with the perception, the movement of time. So as you're interviewing about incidents and you need some sense of like of a timeline of a sequence of events as like a medical response, medical personnel, they're going to become very confused. They think today is actually 10 years ago. Or they'll also mislabel people, places, and objects. They'll name people wrong. For example, they'll see an individual and give them the wrong name or think they're a relative when they are not. They will name their family members as being the conspirators against them. They'll mislabel objects. They think of trombones or razor, for example. So those are the signs that tells you you've got a distinct differences and you need medical assistance, medical intervention in here. Okay? If they are mentally deficient, we're talking an IQ roughly 70 and below. Not that it's 72, they're NASA candidates. Problem you have with this group is they're more concerned about pleasing you, and just sometimes the presence of your gear, the uniform, the emergency vehicle, whether it's police or fire, hazmat or ambulance that shows up, they're more concerned about pleasing and being compliant and not necessarily being accurate. They're not trying to mislead you, but they're incapable of performing some of the basic skills that an interviewer needs them to perform to retrieve information and to be accurate. For those who work in criminal cases, this, by the way, this is where you get your highest number of false confessions from, is from the mentally deficient subject. These are the folks also, if you're in the fire service, who have somebody else who will talk them into doing the act for them, of mixing the chemicals, of setting off the homemade device, or of setting the fire, or they're exploring. And so you've got a completely different set of a type of fire setter or non-compliant person here. Okay, and the final one, and if they're under the effects of drugs or alcohol, the obvious legal problems you have there with diminished capacity, and depending on what medications, which drugs they're abusing, now you have to rely on some of your medical skills for the pupil dilation, for the slurred speech, motor skills, etc. But the legal restrictions that are going on, you may be able at this point to get them to tell you what they've been using, how much, to show you where the medicine is, or perhaps maybe the family can help you with that. And then the one that we're getting more and more of, and found that I've had to add this, and it's a phenomenon that is just devastating to both fire service, to law enforcement. It's having to work through an interpreter. The time to deal with working with interpreters is not to wait till 3 o'clock in the morning, you get a call, and you got to find somebody in the whole county that speaks Slovene. Figure that out now. Figure out where would I get a source. A couple of quick places you can do that. Go to the county clerk's office, the court clerk, and ask them if they have an open purchase order with someone that's called Language Line. It's a company that does law enforcement interpreting services. You can also actually pick up the phone and dial international operator, and you can get online telephone interpreter services right away. They'll give you the operator number, so you can contact with them, and they can have almost every language on the face of the earth is spoken. So you can at least, in a hot situation, hot scene, critical response, have access quickly to some form of interpreter through telephonic services, which you need to record, by the way. My suggestion is record those types of calls if you're talking and interviewing through the interpreter. Other concerns are cultural that go on here. And in some cultures, it's not a matter of right or wrong, it's what they're justified to do it. So that you've got not only social issues, but you've got language issues. Some things don't interpret correctly, an understanding of rights. And so you begin to lose good control and management of your interview. So the excluded group is the mentally disturbed, making up 1%, who are totally confused about identity and so forth. The brain disease, where there's actually physical damage to the brain itself. And so you're going to get a very poor timeline. And these two groups also will not be able to perform basic problem-solving skills that you ask during any normal interview. Mentally deficient with their overly compliant behavior. Don't forget to take into account if they're in effects of drugs or alcohol and the legal limitations. Again, check with your legal experts within your agency about the best way to manage that and to document that, and it should be documented. And then think ahead of time now, start working on a policy about how you would work through interpreters. So once we have the statement, we now have to evaluate our objective again. Have I gotten maximum information? Have I contaminated the statement? And have I maintained compliance? So we want to look at how to glean that information and make an assessment of the value if we're meeting those objectives. During the interview process, I'm going to look at my end product and evaluate its value. Have I gotten all the information that I'm after? Is it a complete statement? So if you're on the scene and you need to talk to the homeowner about the incident, or maybe you're looking at an accident where a construction site where there's been a terrible accident involved, and I need to know what was going on. Tell me the transition events. How do I know that I'm getting that information? How do I evaluate that? So in evaluating the assessment, we'll look at that formula in just a few minutes. I'm going to look for the presence of clusters of behavior. Then this can be verbal and nonverbal from the subject. And in subject, in this case, I'm going to use it as a universal term because it's easier than just having to repeat several terms. So subject could be the victim, subject could be the witness, subject could be the informant, subject could be the homeowner, it could be the business owner, it could be the family members of the medical patient, it could be the patient themselves. So I'm going to use that as a universal term here to make it a little easier, more efficient. So I'm looking for clusters from the subject that suggest that there is something missing or incorrect. For some reason, it felt necessary to withhold information from you. And again, not always malicious. A subject in this case could be the victim. And the victim's embarrassed because they did something they think was silly. Or they're embarrassed because they think that, that you're going to pass judgment on them for being stupid. People with different reasons withhold information. So to assess for the completeness, I'm looking for cues or clusters in the statement that you do in the narrative that says this is the point I need to follow up in cross-examination. For a definition of a cluster, that's two or more symptoms per sentence or response. Two or more symptoms. People will generate random behaviors. Single behaviors don't mean anything. Single behaviors can just be flukes. They can be, again, because of an unfortunate preconception on the part of the interviewer, reading something in. For an example, a cluster would be, honest to God, I don't really know what happened. I can't remember why I was there. Well, I have a memory lapse, and I'm honest to God, and I can't remember why I'm there. That tells me, okay, something's wrong in that point. Or it might be a huge nonverbal behavior. Did you see him when he pulled the equipment out of the storage facility? Did he engage his safety equipment? Well, we talked to engage safety equipment, so I can't imagine why. So you picked up from me, you saw an aversion behavior and a negation cue. So that's what I mean by clusters. Just like there's no single driving behavior means or DUI. In totality, it's the completeness of the behavior. So this helps me find my follow-up points. It helps me find my follow-up dialogue. So now I'm not wasting time by carpet bombing everything the person says, going through, because the time limitation is 4 or 5 minutes, maybe if you're lucky, but I can quickly identify the problem point. What needs to be followed up? What needs greater attention? Now, the presence of a cluster, two or more symptoms be two or more verbal cues, two or more nonverbal cues, or a mixture of the two. Always think in the groupings. Random things occur. That also reduces your workload. Instead of have to micromanage everything, wait. Let the person narrate. If you keep interrupting, that's contamination. Okay? So cluster suggests that there is stress over the issue. And let me clarify something about stress. Just because the subject you're interviewing is under stress doesn't mean they're maliciously withholding information, does it? Can you see the homeowner, if you're interviewing them, under stress as you're on the fire scene? Can you see some of the witnesses at a major accident scene being under stress because of the horrific events they just saw? Sure. There could be the stress of this guy. He is the shift manager on a late night shift at the fuel tank field of a gasoline company, and he's responsible and he's in charge of the fuel when the big huge spill happened. The guy's going to be under stress. Doesn't mean they're going to be malicious, but I need to manage that. I need them to be compliant and cooperative with me, so I have to help them overcome that stress response, something about that issue. So cluster identifies stress. You can also identify places where there could be missing details. For example, we've heard things like after a while, the next thing I knew, lo and behold, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, as they're describing a timeline. And you see them skip through the timeline and they'll skip points and details. So it's missing details and possibly, let me emphasize the possibly, deception. Just because you're under stress doesn't mean you're being deceptive. Call that people under stress are not necessarily deceptive, but deception behaviors are a type of stress. You'll most likely find it, if it's there, in here. And it may be withholding information, okay? Now in this statement, if you find 4 or more cluster groups, so in the narrative, you're going to tell the whole story all the way through, and you find about 4 spots. Like, think of like an essay test you're taking for college or for school, and you got to read an essay exam. The instructor goes back and looks for points in your essay that says he or she doesn't know what she's talking about right here. She's faking it. Then, if you got 4 more of those, you need to slow down. You know, time may be the essence here, and you may have to really compress this. But if you move too quickly, you'll miss this. And you're going to miss those points, and you're going to make a poor call or poor decision on the scene about the next step, deployment of equipment, etc. So if you got 4 or more, something else is going in the background. There's another trauma, there's another concern that's intruding here that's causing a problem. And your questions may be too broad, so you're encompassing too much. You may need to refine the questions you're asking. We'll look at how to refine, create that process. So this is part of the value assessment they're looking for. And we got another set of values also that we're looking for that tells me to judge the quality and the completeness of the statement. So the second set of values includes these elements. Other values we're looking for to make sure we've gotten the best statement possible. The most reliable statements we get is when we've run 2 to 3 different turns, if you will, or variations through the narrative sample. Now, this is up to you depending on the situation, depending on the type of the case. I like to say we use 3 samples with 2 levels of difficulty. In other words, just don't sample the interview one time. Again, depending on your time limitations, this is scene specific. This is based on what your time limits and the conditions demand of you. If it's a hot, critical incident and you've got 1 pass at it, make it a damn good pass. If you've got time where you can go back and recover more information to really make sure your data mined for accuracy, then you can hit 2 to 3 times. But we're going to change, notice I have 2 levels of difficulty, we're going to change that. So the narrative, for example, I'm talking about here, recently worked on a robbery case involving a girl at a convenience store. First responder came in. She was a victim of an armed robbery and a sexual assault. And a first responder came in to a response. Tell me what happened. Are you okay? You're safe? Do you need any medical help? Tell me what happened. And has her narrate the story. Corporal shows up on scene. Says, listen, we want to make sure this guy gets caught. We don't let anybody get away with this. Nobody does this to someone. Go through it again. Tell me what happened so I get an alert out for this guy. I want to get a bolo out to locate him. Go through it again. Tell me what happened. So there's your second pass. Crime scene guy shows up. Are you okay? Need anything? I'm here to take pictures. I'm here to photograph the scene. I'm here to collect evidence. Would you walk with me? Walk through and show me what happened. Now look what happened. We've got 3 different types of, all narratives, but 3 different types of narratives. So they've sampled her statement. In this case, it works out 3 times. And so now they can see the consistencies, or the tendency is the details get richer and clearer as you do that. So what you might miss on the first pass, you can pick up again on the second and third pass. So if you have the luxury with time, try to get 2 to 3 different turns of it. It doesn't have to take again forever. And we're talking here maybe at a maximum 5 to 6 minutes. But an interdiction case, a road officer, traffic stop, interstate, we're talking 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Easy to pull off. It depends on the situation and, again, your time restrictions. Now, the cues that we want to look for signs of missing information, incomplete responses, don't forget we talked about they involve any verbal cues. That could be a shift to anger. It could be a sudden shift to depression. It could be a sudden shift into bargaining or compliant behavior. You can hear the emotional shift in the person, and or any non-verbal behaviors. Facial expressions. Don't forget also with nonverbal that some people under stress become very, very still. can almost lock down. That is just as significant as a person who's moving and jumping and gesturing a lot. So it's a shift from that baseline we talked about in orientation. You're seeing a change, and it's associated with the topic. That's your key. So when we go to cross-examination, that's the topic I talk about a little bit more. That's where it could be a problem. Okay? Now, for example, in the robbery case I just used, this naturally occurred. First responder gets the first statement. And there was a couple-minute break, or several minutes break until the next guy came in, the corporal came in. Then there's a little bit of a break, and then the crime scene guy came in. So if you are going to do more than one pass, just don't do them bang, bang, bang. Do a statement, divert them for a minute, take care of needs, bathroom, cigarette, soda, Dr. Pepper, Reese cup, whatever it is, and then run it again. And see if you're trying to glean, you're harvesting that information. So put a little time break in between each of these if you're going to go the full-blown repetitive route. If you're only doing one, we've got to make that first one do the best. Long area here, but talking about documenting a statement. Now, there's a lot of different philosophies and trains of thought on note-taking. I can tell you from the scientific point, whether it's a fire case, whether it's a law enforcement case, incident response, detailed note-taking is one of the most destructive things interviewers have. It's one of the most destructive processes because the interviewer stops communicating, stops listening to the subject, and it breaks that continuity. If it is that critical that you've got to have word for word, abide by state statutes here, this is where I would have my recorder in plain view and ask them, may I go ahead and document the statement by taping it. But again, that's something you need to work out in your procedures. You need to talk to the legal beagles about first, and considering state statutes, whichever jurisdiction you're in, and about single dual consent. But in this case, I use a digital recorder and I have it in plain view and they understand that I am taping the statement. So, but verbatim note-taking really destroys the process, and despite your claims, we're not good at taking notes. We'll miss, the studies I've looked at, we miss 50% of the information in note-taking. And what we do right has about a 30% error rate. So consider that as a way to improve this narrative process in recovering details. So now the narrative itself, notice I said right back in here, in the robbery case, the interviewer walked on the scene, the first responder, and said, what? Tell me what happened. They were using an open-ended narrative type of question that started the dialogue, that started the narration, and it literally gives the floor, hands it to the subject and says, now tell me what happened. Tell me your version of events, your story. And I facilitate as they're running through that statement. That's what I'm looking for. So let's look at the samples and the levels of difficulty and the actual structure itself of this narrative recovery and how we get that details. So we mentioned in our value assessment that we want to, if we can, depending on the time limitations, try to get 3 statements. Again, this could be at the scene if you got a major spill, you've got a huge incident scene, fire scene, disaster scene, the robberies I suggested, maybe you got a fatal accident scene, for example. The reason I'm changing the sampling is a process that's associated with what's called reality monitoring. If you ask the same question, the same stimulus question again and again and again, don't be surprised if you keep getting what? The same answer. I'm changing the stimulus. It's like sampling. Sampling water, I want to make sure that I use several different sampling techniques, or sampling like after a spill, and I want to sample different portions of the ground and use different types of sampling grades. That's what we're looking at. So the first sample was going to be the very narrative-based. This is your opening sample, a very narrative-based sample. The risk here and the challenge for the subject is very minimal. This is what builds that compliance, we said is one of our goals. It builds that cooperation. And they have a sense, you're concerned, I'm listening to you. What you say is of value to me. And it encourages that. The second sample, I will now go back and look for those cues, those clusters we mentioned, and pinpoint those areas as needing a little more attention. And so now I've called attention to those areas, and I will ask questions that are more specific. Think of like using Google. If you were to Google the word plumber, how many hits would you get? Hundreds and thousands of hits, right? If I Googled plumber Jefferson County, how many hits would I get? Well, there's 6 Jefferson counties in the United States, so which one? If I Googled plumber Jefferson County, Kentucky, which is the Louisville area, how many hits would I get? Okay. See my search is getting smaller and I'm becoming more refined. If I Googled plumber Jefferson County, Kentucky, tankless water heaters, think of this as like Googling somebody's database. The more specific and the better detailed your question, the more accurate and specific your response. So that's where we're changing this sampling process. The narrative is the first search. The cross-examination, I'm narrowing it down until I refine to getting the specific details I want. So now I make that informed decision as the commander, or as a scene commander, or as emergency response commander. So I'm sampling that detail. So the second one is going to be sampling a little bit differently. We're going to look at things like what's called reality monitoring, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. Third sample, I will look at emotion. So our first sample is going to be the narrative-based sample. Remember the robbery I told you about? The first response, the interviewer asked, tell me what happened. Or the first responder to the robbery, tell me what happened. I could be at a spill scene, I could be at an industrial accident scene. Tell me what happened. Now you can change it anyway. You could change it and say, tell me about the phone conversation you had. Describe the board meeting you were just in. Tell me what happened the time the last inspector was here, was inspecting your system, or was inspecting for code. And I can use that as my stimulus. But it says, relate to me events, and I let them talk. Your job is to not to interrupt, but to facilitate and let them continue the dialogue. If they bog down, you can encourage by, then what happened? Or what went on next? And use that to say, go ahead and finish. If you have questions, you hold those a little bit later. Because if you interrupt this person in a train of thought, it blows that recall process. And so we're looking for them to get that first sample, that first timeline. Now this can be verbal. If necessary, it can be written. Now written takes a lot more labor, a lot more effort. People don't write as clearly and as much as they would if they were to speak it. It's too labor intensive. If that's the only way that you can get that, that's still acceptable, it still applies. So as they're narrating, let them talk. Don't interrupt them. Let them give you the sets of details. Again, if you want to document it, now I do cheat sheet notes. Earl drinking how much? Whose gun? Whose shift? Tommy who? Just to remind myself. That I might do. But I'm not going to go into great detail because I've stopped listening in my train of thought someplace else. And my subject is also distracted from my effort. So let's say we had an incident where a family member, elderly family member is found in a home, and if they fall and have a broken hip or something like that, or there appears to be neglect. And I might ask the family members, okay, tell me what happened when you came home, okay? Now let's say that we get the call at 4 in the afternoon, just for a time point. I might have them describe, start at noon today and go all the way through everything that happened in the house until the point you found Uncle Leroy at the bottom of the stairs. And I'll have them go ahead of the event. It's called a preamble. Only reason I'm doing that is that helps establish my baseline, my orientation. Warms them up, I get details, I'm building compliance. And I can also see when they move to a problem spot, it's easier to spot those changes or clusters we're looking for. Now, it won't take them 2 hours to do it. Don't worry about that. But just put them a little ahead of the event, particularly if you're looking at an incident itself. Okay? Or you can tell me where we were going, where we headed. Tell me about the transaction on the car. Sometime you're interesting to read about the arrest of Timothy McVeigh and his excuse to the first responder who stopped him. Try to tell him it was a new car, they were still filling out the paperwork, that's why he didn't have the license plate and the title receipts and so forth in the glove box. That's what caught the attention of the trooper in Oklahoma who arrested Timothy McVeigh. Look at that story. And it's essentially those parts that made that trooper suspicious that pulled Timothy McVeigh over as that first responder. Okay? So try to get him 2 hour preamble and let them go through it. Don't interrupt them. Let them relate the events. If they get bogged down, what happened next? Then tell me what. Or where'd you go from there? Or then what'd you do? Okay, and then what? If you interrupt, you're going to wind up contaminating them. So stay out of the way. Again, you're just the facilitator. Now, if you have someone who's uncooperative, and that's going to happen for many reasons, the spill scene, the environmental disaster scene, the fire scene, the robbery scene, and so forth, you may have to use what I call a negative interview. And this is kind of my last-ditch effort. I'll try to be creative. I'll ask questions I already know the answer to. Have you ever seen him before? Where do you work? Have you dated this person? What is she like when she does? Have you ever borrowed Mr. Johnson's car? Has the boss ever caught you living in his trailer in the back of his property? And I'll ask questions and I'll get them specific, say, just give me an answer, yes or no, don't explain. And I'll have that documented. Just a yes or no answer. And then all I have to do later is prove they lied to each of those points. I don't tell them what I have, but I ask very specific questions. And so now they're in the dark. They don't know what information I possess and don't possess. So once I let them run that first narrative, they tell me what happened or describe the accident scene, describe the inspections, the board meeting, etc. That's my first statement. And now I start looking for specific points in that statement. So on my follow-up, now my level 2 is when I begin to look at those points and use follow-up questions to hit each of those points to glean out and harvest the missing information. This is what level 2 looks like. Now, I have to tell you on this level 2 analysis, this is my most favorite tool. I'm very biased about this. Something about human memory and the way it recovers information. There's been extensive research on victim interviews by some experts, Geisselman, Fisher, and Raymond, in a process called cognitive interview. They focused in the research initially on how to get details from victims and witnesses, especially if they were traumatized. And they're looking at what was working and how to not contaminate the victims. Now, think how this would apply if you're on the incident scene or the crime scene, how this would apply. One of the interesting things I saw in the research back in 1986, they had the person go through the events in reverse order. Had them go in reverse. Now, you don't say, tell me your story backwards. It wasn't that. Okay, I know Tommy said the guy fired a shotgun and hit him before he ran out of the bar. What was going on right before he fired the shotgun and ran out of the bar? What was he doing? Tell me that part again. I'm a little confused. Okay, now what was going on? You said he was kicking the devil out of the jukebox and he's picking up all the quarters off the floor and the lady was screaming in the corner that he was threatening. Go to that part and tell me what was going on right before that. Now the beauty of this, what they discovered with victims and witnesses is it turned the brain into very analytical and their details got very, very crisp, became very, very content rich. Got really good details. And you weren't contaminating them. See, again, I haven't used a contaminating style yet. What I thought of was that this would be neat. I can use this with subjects who are deliberately trying to mislead me. The people who are misleading you, they got more confused. Their stories started to fall apart. And it was easier to spot the deception. Well, that's now been picked up, and there's been 4 different studies looking at that and found it increases our ability to spot the deceptive subject up to 68%. Improves the ability to find those specific spots. So it's a two-pronged effect. If I have a traumatized victim or witnesses, I can use a reverse sequence, what happened just before that, what happened before that, and I get a really good detailed statement. If the person happens to be malicious in their statement, it makes that stand out. So now when they're doing this, just pick a point and work in reverse order. Okay? And you go back and what happened before then, tell me about that part. If they start to struggle, what do? We stay quiet. Don't interrupt. This good guy or the bad guy. Don't interrupt them because you're contaminating them. And you want to keep your mouth shut at this point. Otherwise you're going to build a preconception in them. So if you let them continue. If they get confused, they get struggling, you want them to work their own way through it. If it's the victim or witness, you're going to contaminate the statement with them. Something reverse. So now if I've taken notes, like my cheat sheet notes, or drinking how much and so forth, places where I had a question, I'll notice when they go back to the sample again, they tend to hit those same spots they did the first time through. So now you got confirmation. You sampled it twice, and you keep consistently seeing reaction. In the robbery I told you about in the convenience store, they saw the victim was consistent on one part of the crime, but she kept having a problem on the second part of the crime. And that's where the investigators begin to focus. Later we learn that's where she made up part of the story and was trying to blame part of the theft on the bandit when she in fact gotten some of the money. And so it made this stand out. It sensitized that particular point. The other element that you can use is now think of how the five senses, and we can look at sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. So I would ask, for example, in the robbery, okay, this is very important, may not make sense to you, what were his exact words when he ran into the bar and was yelling at you? What did he say? If somebody's in the bathroom, heard it, what did they hear? You know, or I've had with consultant on fire cases, talking a particular arson case, and they were having trouble with the subject. I said, have him describe where he was standing. He said he was at the scene, he acknowledges that, but we need the timing. Where was he standing? Now have him describe to you what the building looked like. How many windows? What size of windows? Have him describe to you when he got there, which windows did he see the flames coming out of? What color were the flames? Which windows did he see the smoke coming out of? What color was the smoke that he saw? And what the subject does not realize they're doing, they're actually giving the timeline of the fire. And so the only way he could have seen that particular involvement, the spread of the fire, those particular windows, particular smoke, tells him exactly the time, and it put him at the fire scene before the fire department responded, and yet the fire suppression system already kicked off before it exhausted. So you can have him look at vision. You can have him do smells. What did you smell or taste? And worked in a homicide case, an alleged kidnapping case. And then the subject talk about holding his daughter and visualizing holding his daughter in his arms and that he must do something for his baby daughter. And it was so vivid for him because that was the biggest problem in his story. That's where he broke. And he gave us the details. We found the child, the kidnapping had been covered up. Sexual neglect of a child who had starved to death and the body had been disposed of. So sometimes you uncover those wonderful gifts. So have him describe one in his sights. It's called reality monitoring. Only sound, possibly tastes. If that's in, maybe if in a place where you have a spill and they can have a particular taste within the mouth because of noxious gas or poison gas or inhalation of certain smokes and so forth. What they heard, what did they hear popping, what did they hear burning, what sounds, how many shots did they hear, the sounds in specific sequence. So now I'm doing that Google search, I'm going down layer by layer and peeling off information. So you've got the narrative, and run through, tell me what happened. Then Google search a little bit deeper, use a reversal process, and go through the timeline, watching the reverse sequence. Then peel it off by looking at sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. Then our third level, we can look at the cognitive emotional state of the subject. Let's take a look at our formula of what we learned so far of the narrative-based field interview. Our first element was, again, the orientation process. Remember, my goal here, number one, was establishing a rapport. I want this person to understand that I am interested in their statements, that I value their comments, I value their observations, and to understand that what the information they have is critical for me as a decision maker. At the same time, I'm establishing a sense of a baseline, or the clinical technical term is calling, I establish a constant for that person's behavior. I take a quick assessment evaluation of their speech behavior, their body language, intelligence, and so forth. The meat then is the narrative portion. A goal here is to data mine as much information as possible. This is the information harvesting, would be a way to describe that. How much information can I harvest at this point? And the subject's allowed to narrate. It's an open-ended question. I don't interrupt. And I'm watching for those changes, or we define as calling clusters, which affect the overall value of the statement. This is my source. Now, on the follow-up, when I go to cross-examination, just like the attorney in the trial, you've made a statement, and he's going to ask you, let's go back and talk about. This is where we said we can now challenge or retest the statement. We can use a reversal of time. Tell me what happened just before then. What occurred before that? What was going on before that? I can also ask them to describe to me only sight stimulus. I can have them describe, this is called reality monitoring, by the way. I can ask them to describe only things that they heard, voices, conversations, sounds, pops, number of shots, explosions. I can have them describe just what they've tasted or what they've smelled or touch sensations, heat, fatigue, etc. Final element we use in cross-examination is what we're going to call role reversal. And it's just as it sounds. I'm going to have the person change or reverse the role. Instead of being themselves, I'll have them describe the events from the point of view of the victim. If, for example, they're not the victim. And I'll tell them, you know her well enough. This is your buddy, you guys play golf together, you go fishing together. What would your buddy do? How would he act? You know what the closing procedures are like at the plant. You know what the inspection is like. Go through that inspection. What would somebody do? What's the right procedure for the closing, for shutting off and cutting off and diverting valves? And have them describe from the role of that individual person. If somebody saw you doing it, and this, a small variation is this, is called the omnipotent view, but it's the same thing, reversing the role. If somebody was watching you go through the closing procedure, what would they say you did? What would they see you do as you went through the inspection? How would they describe what they saw you do? So it's now looking from somebody looking in. So we have our orientation, our narration. So we got our first samples. Now we're testing it. We're Googling the information. And now when we find what we want in Google, what do? We found what we want. We've stopped on that page and we solved the problem that we're looking for, that we're Googling. I found the plumber. Now, let's see what I want that plumber to do. I found the problem, the missing information. My question has been answered about why did this occur this way? Why the events transpire like this? What did the victim really see? And I've resolved any conflicts, any inconsistencies, and now I have a clear perception of events, and now I can make my informed decision. What's my next step? As the commander, as a detective, as a first responder, in your addiction, do I search, not search, etc. And then be able to articulate, this is how I came to this point. So it's taking the interview and making it into a decision-making model. Go ahead and establish the problem. Narration, let them describe the events. Cross-examine, I've tested and challenged, made sure I've got all the gaps filled. I've done an in-depth Google search of information. And now I have a clear view, perception of the issue, of the events, and what happened, and I've closed the loop with my resolution. If it's a criminal case, this means you've made all the elements for the crime. If it's a case of negligence, for, like say a first responder, for a critical incident, or for a spill or whatever, then I've found out who's responsible. I've answered that question, how the events transpire. So that closes that loop. This is my end game. If I maxed the information, I made an informed decision based on the recovery. So let's talk about the time component as its final step. It sounds like it takes, I described to you earlier, it sounds like it takes forever. This can be done in a very short period of time. Let's take the interdiction officer, for example, who is sitting on the interstate and he sees the vehicle come past, make a decision, stop, interacts with the passenger, interacts with the driver, and decides within 2 to 3 minutes, I got a problem here, we've got either contraband, we've got drugs, it's time for a search, stop, call in K9. We're talking 2 to 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes outside. 10 would not be unusual. This could be the first commander on the scene. You've got a 3-alarm situation. He's going to decide what's in the building, the people who just left the building, what part of the building is involved, what assets are at risk or hazardous, which may be a risk to my staff, to my personnel, to the community. Where do I deploy my resources? We're talking as a response time in minutes. But this case, we can get it down, gather them together, 90-second decision. Deploy here, here, and here, and here. And then I can make another assessment. And it's a good point here. This is not static. It doesn't have to be only one time. As new information comes in, as a scene commander, as new information comes in, you can run that same decision-making model again and refine and reset your decision. So it's a fluid process if you need to. Each new incident, each new problem, glean the information from your personnel, glean information from the subjects, reassess, and redeploy again to move your assets and to move your resources. So it's not, in a homicide, this could be 2-3 days, 10 to 12 different interviews. An interdiction officer, 2 people in a U-Haul van on the side of the interstate, 5 minutes. So it's quick decision-making model, even up to the 20 to 30-minute, 30-second decisions going to be made, deploy resources, or to the long involved case. Easy to adapt, time expandable, or time compressible.